On a recent episode of her always excellent Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray discussed Supreme Court reform. One of her guests, lawyer Nicholas Bowie, who actually provided testimony at the White House Commission for the Supreme Court, described a major issue he sees in the judicial branch. Let's take a listen.
The issue with anything, including a wealth tax, including a Voting Rights Act, it's when Congress and the Supreme Court disagree about what the Constitution requires, who should win? And so there's disagreement about whether the Constitution allows a wealth tax. There's disagreement about whether the Constitution allows a Voting Rights Act. And so I want to live in a democracy. I want to live in a country in which I am a political equal with everybody else. And we, as a community of 340 million people, can decide for ourselves what kind of society we want to live in. And right now we can't. Right now, 339 million of us can decide one thing, but 5 people can say, we think the Constitution means something different, and therefore it does. And that is a severe problem for a democracy.
Joining us now to discuss the remarks is former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, contributing editor at Current Affairs, and co-host of Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna, welcome.
Thank you, Ryan.
And so what did you take away from your most recent episode?
So I think a lot of viewers, listeners might recall that about a year ago, even 2 years ago, we were having a pretty hot and heavy conversation as a nation about what to do about the Supreme Court. It seemed like every other day there was an article out at Vox or some other big publication that was asking the question of what to do about the fact that Donald Trump had packed the courts, as it were, not just the Supreme Court, but the federal courts, because Republicans are so much more efficient at having a pipeline of ideologically aligned judges and much more efficient at having conservative judges retire while there were conservatives in office so they can be replaced by a conservative president. Democrats, on the other hand, found themselves in a somewhat unlucky situation because Ruth Bader Ginsburg's choice not to step down during Obama's presidency, despite the fact that she was not just older, but had suffered from one of the most difficult to beat kinds of cancer, and also obviously the big kerfuffle around the Merrick Garland appointment. So, given the fact that we now had a conservative court, what should we do about it? And a lot of folks were talking about various kinds of plans to reform the court. And one of the historical precedents they looked to was FDR, who famously was in a moment much like Joe Biden is right now, dealing with a huge crisis of an enormous scale and passing actually very popular legislation that was getting struck down over and over again as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And the apocryphal story is that by challenging or even threatening to pack the Supreme Court, that means to add members of the Supreme Court so that there were more members that were friendly to his legislation, growing the number over 9, which is not a constitutionally mandated number by any means, that they eventually kowtowed and started passing his legislation. So in this conversation, we asked these panelists, what should we be doing in this moment? And Nico Bowie, who's a Harvard law professor, put forward that this idea we have that the Supreme Court actually is good, that it's anti-democratic, that it's anti-majoritarian, that it's there to protect the rights of vulnerable minorities, it doesn't actually bear out historically. And that historically, over and over again, the Supreme Court has been the body, the undemocratic, unelected body that has ended up undermining more progressive legislation from Congress. And he asks whether we should consider taking away some of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction and limiting the extent to which it has the ability to do what's called judicial review.
Yeah, and I feel like I'd like to get your sense on this as to draw on your own legal experience. I feel like there's sort of a myopia of our lived experience and our recent memory on this, because as you said, the Supreme Court, say from the 1950s up until the 1990s, was a place that was kind of driving progress forward, or at least was moving in step with cultural progress. But that was an anomaly. And it wasn't and it wasn't universal, of course, but it was also anomalous in the course of history, that throughout the rest of the time the Supreme Court was really a check and was ruling basic things like bans on child labor practices or minimum wage or other things that we just take for granted now across the political spectrum. They were ruling these unconstitutional. So tell me if I have the history right. It was the National Labor Relations Act, right? That was the first one that the Supreme Court under FDR kind of green-lit, where they had been striking down everything that the New Deal was doing. Then he threatened to pack the court. And then he passed the National Labor Relations Act, the big business sues, and the Supreme Court is like, you know what? And I think it was 5-4 decision. You know what? Actually, this is fine. So, and let's move on from all this discussion of packing this court.
Right. So, some people say that story, the narrative that says FDR's threat is what made the, what do they call it, a switch in time saves 9. There's some pushback historically about whether or not that's actually what caused the Supreme Court to take a different turn. And the justices themselves said that, of course, that decision had no bearing on
What's the alternative
their
theory? What's the alternative explanation for them starting to green light the New Deal?
They were deciding cases on the merits. But this is part of what was so rich about this conversation. The Supreme Court is fundamentally a political body, right? And we can pretend that it's not, and we can sit here and pretend that these judges are neutral, and we can pretend that the law is this fixed, hallowed thing, and there are all of these right and wrong answers that these sage elite men who went to Harvard and Yale historically and currently, have the exclusive wisdom to decide on. But one of the points that Professor Bowie was making, and also a point I think that Eric Siegel was making on the show, who's also a law professor in Georgia, was that is not at all the case, and that we have kind of delegated all of this authority to so-called professionals that are weighing in on issues that are nowhere within their professional expertise. Issues like abortion and civil rights that don't necessarily require a lawyer to decide. It would be much more comfortable with the legislature, a democratically elected legislature, deciding what's going on there.
And my read on the politics from Democrats is that people like Schumer were gung-ho about expanding the court leading into the election, as they were fighting back against Amy Coney Barrett being rushed through. He was talking about expanding the circuit courts and district courts as well. And then when they underperformed in the Senate races, particularly in, let's say, Iowa, Maine, and North Carolina, and they thought, now we lost the Senate. Now they shocked themselves by winning it in Georgia soon after that. But in that period from November to January, they gave up, it seems like, on expanding the Supreme Court at a minimum, and maybe on their court reform more generally,
right.
Because I feel like they got a sense that they were punished by voters for talking about it, that it brought, say, Trump people out to the polls or something. I'm not saying that they're right, but it's sort of like they got scared of their shadow again. What's your read on what changed from October to today?
Well, for one, I think that regardless of whether or not it's true, there is definitely the perception from the Biden camp that this was a sticky wicket that they didn't want to deal with in the middle of a very close general election. And the fact that this commission, which occurred at the end of last month, the commission on which two of our panelists on our most recent episode appeared, that commission was the punt from the Biden administration. I hear you guys have all of these questions about Supreme Court reform. I will hold a commission to investigate it later once I'm president, as a way not to have to say yes or no what he felt about the underlying issue in a way that might polarize voters. But this was also an interesting political question that came up on the podcast, which is this. Right now, America is polarized around these Supreme Court issues because the issues that are focused on are those so-called, cultural issues that are, in fact, polarizing, things like abortion and affirmative action. But the reality is, and Senator Whitehouse has spoken about this at length and tried to really raise the profile of this fact, the overwhelming majority of 5-4 conservative decisions are decisions which uphold and entrench kind of financial elitism that hold up the oligarchies. Cases like Citizens United, cases which undermine campaign finance reform, cases that make it difficult to tax the rich, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I argued on the podcast that potentially if Democrats stopped framing Supreme Court issues in purely cultural terms, but talked about what the real project of FedSoc and what the real project of the Supreme Court is, which is to entrench a oligarchy and make it more difficult for working people to have rights and privileges, then maybe talking about Supreme Court reform wouldn't be so polarizing. And that brings us back to the FDR example, where he was an enormously popular president who had a mandate that was unmatched, who was passing enormously popular policies in a unprecedented crisis. And if the Supreme Court were ever going to be afraid of the blowback from not passing those policies, if anybody ever had the leverage to say, hey, I'm going to sit down in a fireside chat and say to America, the Supreme Court is blocking the things that you elected me to do, it was someone like FDR. And it's not clear to me necessarily that Biden has that same kind of profile and leverage.
How responsive to politics and to polling do you think the Supreme Court actually is? And I'm thinking now about the most recent Obamacare decision. Like my guess would be that of the 6 justices, the 6 Republican justices on the court, at least 5 of those think in their heart of hearts, their legal heart of hearts, that the Affordable Care Act ought to be deemed unconstitutional, top to bottom, most of it. Yet they didn't do that. Do you think that's an example of them feeling political pressure to approve something that they don't otherwise want to approve, or do you think that they actually are okay with it, and that's not where they want to fight?
That's an interesting question. And if you look to history, the indication is that the Supreme Court is actually quite responsive to the people. There is this narrative, we opened this conversation by talking about this. There is a narrative that the Supreme Court has been, at least in the last 80, 90 years or so, at the vanguard of social movements, that it's been leading the way in terms of progress and change. But more scrutiny reveals that it has, in fact, been very responsive to changes that have been happening on the ground. A week or two ago, we had a different guest on the show, and the broader conversation is about CRT. But Irami was explaining that you can't look at a case like Brown v. Board, which is held up often as an example of the Supreme Court leading and protecting minority rights. You can't look at Brown v. Board without looking at the Cold War and looking at the extent to which the court felt overwhelming political pressure and shame about the fact that we were evangelizing democracy across the globe at the same time that we had a two-tiered apartheid system in our own country. And that's what really motivated the court, not to mention, obviously, all of the protests and civil rights movement that was going on at the time. And frankly, in law school, I took a very formative class with Professor Bowie's mother, Lonnie Guinier, and about law and social movements. And one of the cases that was made in that class was that, in fact, laws tend to follow social movements, not the other way around. So I would not be surprised if you're right in your assessment of what's been going on with the Affordable Care Act in the Supreme Court.
I think the comparison to dictatorships might actually be instructive. Not necessarily that the Supreme Court is a dictatorship. They do have some of the characteristics of it. They serve for life and they're not elected. But in a true dictatorship, what I think people don't understand is that those dictators are actually extremely responsive to public opinion. They love the situation that they have going on. They want to keep it going, and they know that in order for them to continue governing, they have to keep people at least satisfied enough to not overthrow them. Now, the way that they're responsive, but often the way they respond is by torturing and killing dissident movements. So, it's not an ideal way for the people to express their support or opposition to a form of government. But the Supreme Court, I think, does recognize that its extraordinary role right now in our government is something of an accident of history, and it goes back to what Nicholas Bowie was saying. Why is it that they are the final arbiters of whether or not a minimum wage is constitutional or not, rather than the people? And do you think that they recognize how shaky their position is?
Yeah, look, we as Americans have had it drilled into our head that our system of government is kind of the be all end all. We're the best democracy in the world. And it's hard for us sometimes to break out of those modes and realize, hey, the right of judicial review, the idea that the courts can strike down laws that they deem to be inconsistent with the Constitution, that is not something that's in the Constitution. That was decided in Marbury v. Madison. That is a right that has been derived from elsewhere. Right? And that we could do things very differently. We could have a different system. There are plenty of other esteemed liberal democracies that we consider to be peer nations, places like England, places like New Zealand, that manage to protect the rights of minorities, that have gay marriage and abortion rights without having constitutions, without having this kind of judicial review that is really heralded by us. And recently, in fact, we had a viral debate with Glenn Greenwald and Nathan Robinson on our podcast, in which Glenn Greenwald was making this argument that the anti-majoritarian leaning of the courts, or essence of the courts, is good because it protected things like gay rights, for instance. But what was so, I think, rich about the conversation we had on the podcast is looking actually at the historical record, which Professor Bowie did such a great job of laying out, to see that that is not exactly how things have borne out historically over time. And that if we want to have a strong democracy and strong protections, what we need to be wary of is the fact that there is a veiled minority of elites that is actually determining what these outcomes are at the highest level of our highest court. And we should question what the best way is about reforming that, whether it is reforming the court itself or having a more fulsome conversation as a community about who is funding FedSoc and what the real interests are in having a conservative court. Because I would put to you that abortion is not their main objective.
Right. No, you're right. It never has been, although they may end up doing it just because they kind of caught the car, so to speak.
Right. I mean, there was a podcast, I think last summer, that on which Nancy Pelosi kind of, interestingly said, abortion is not going anywhere. I mean, there seems to be this understanding that it's a political football that both sides can wield to effect to rally their base. And the status quo is beneficial to both parties to that end, which is a pretty crude and gross thing to consider when you think about how important this right is to so many women, and also the extent to which it's being used to hide the ball of other kinds of overreaches that also enormously affect the rights of women and other marginalized groups, including every poor and working class person in America.
Although another thing we've seen is that elites don't always know what they're getting into when they empower forces. They think that they're benefiting themselves. John Boehner never would have seen the Tea Party coming around to annihilate his career when Saudi Arabia was funding jihadists and madrasas. They didn't expect that would come boomeranging back to them. Sometimes you kind of fuel these more extremist tendencies, and then they take on a life of their own, and you might end up with some true believers actually on the Supreme Court who don't get that, hey, this was just something that we were ginning up to keep people divided and to get people coming out to the polls. Why are you taking this so seriously? We're very confused now. So you never know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the fact that those instances that you laid out have happened, and there's still a kind of political indifference to the possibility, to the risk of heading down some of these roads, I think it's part of why we have so little confidence in government.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. That's well said. Briahna Joy Gray, co-host of the Bad Faith podcast. Go subscribe to it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.